It's showtime. Hello and welcome to another A Tippling Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pierce. Welcome, 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 welcome. I am going to both tipple and philosophize tonight, and there's not an awful lot you can do about it. You can change the channel, you can turn your computer off, or throw your phone on the floor. But I'm still going to do this. So there you go. Question is, was I always going to do this? Was I always going to do this? I guess maybe I was, but I'm all right with that. So we're going to talk about free will tonight and whether free will exists. Um, and we're going to talk about philosophy. We're going to talk about science, a little bit of philosophy of religion, but only like the minutest bit. And we're going to kind of maybe have a little chat at the end about what do we do with this knowledge? What do we do with these ideas? So what I'm going to be doing is using an old PowerPoint presentation because I used to do this talk about free will. It's my first ever talk. I do about 7 different public talks now, but this is my first one. I haven't done it for years, and this PowerPoint is years old, and itself was based on an old PowerPoint from years before that. So this is a lot of words, right? The first rule of Public Talking Club is, don't use wordy PowerPoints that are a bit crap. And the second rule of Public Talking Club is, have wordy PowerPoints so you don't forget what you're supposed to say. Just to let you know, my caveat is I've got multiple sclerosis, progressive multiple sclerosis. So I'm not very good with my words anymore. And I need prompts like this to help me get through the presentation. Look, there's a bunch of books I've written. I've updated that bit because I've written a bunch more since I did this talk last. Anyway, whatever. Go and buy them. You don't have to read them. Just buy 10 copies of each. And you'll be all the better for it. So, free will. I'm going to talk about free will, as you know. Let's talk about the 3 different positions first. They are, and there are nuances of each of these. But broadly speaking, we have the libertarian position. That's not to be confused with political libertarianism. There is the determinist position, and there's a compatibilist position. So let's just quickly go through those positions. I have an awful lot to talk about tonight, so I probably will rattle on through. So before I talk about those 3 positions, let's just bring in the whole God discussion just really shortly. And it's not so much about whether or not God exists, but it's just to say that this conversation about free will is more fundamental than the conversation about whether God exists, because most versions of God are a belief in a judgmental God. So God that judges you for doing X and Y. You've chosen to do that, therefore I'm going to put you in heaven. You've chosen to do that, therefore I'm going to put you in hell. And I'm connecting your decision and your actions with the reward or punishment. Now, if you were always going to do that because you actually don't have free will, then it's unfair for me to judge you in those ways and to commit you to heaven and to commit you to hell if you were always going to do that. So, therefore, the idea of a judgmental God is completely dependent upon the idea of whether this version of free will exists or not. Unless you are something like a Calvinist. So, in America, you get these sort of Calvinist religious positions, Christian positions who believe in God, but also that you don't have free will and that you were always going to do that. But God has designed you and knew ahead of the game that you were always going to do that, and you're going to go to hell and you're going to go to heaven. To me, that's sort of morally dodgy. But basically, the point of saying this is if you can't establish libertarian free will, you cannot establish a judgmental God. So if you believe in a judgmental God, first of all, you need to solve this libertarian free will problem. What you'll find, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, is that almost every philosopher who believes, or Christian philosopher, theistic philosopher who believes in a judgmental God will also believe in libertarian free will. The problem is libertarian free will, I will argue, makes no sense. And we've got data to support the connection between those who believe in libertarian free will and those who believe in God, or vice versa. So anyway, you get my point. I'm not going to. That's probably, apart from a little bit to talk about that metadata, probably the last thing I'm going to mention God tonight. So don't worry about that. Oh no, I've done it already. So libertarian. What does a libertarian believe? So the libertarian believes that we have ownership over our decisions. We own those decisions. We choose to do them. We are morally responsible for doing them. We are totally causally responsible for doing them. But we also could have done otherwise. This is sometimes known as a garden of forking paths. The idea that you could have gone down that path, or you could have gone down that path at exactly the same point in time. This in philosophy is known as a principle of alternate possibilities. You, that you have this principle that at any point in time, any given point, you could do this, or you could do something alternate to that. You could do A and not A, if you like. Um, so that is that idea. The term determinist believes, on the other hand, that everything adheres to the laws of nature. And these laws are deterministic, which means you have cause and effect. Everything that happens has conditions that mean that nothing else could have happened. In other words, this garden of forking paths model of reality is wrong. We do not have the principle of alternate possibilities, and you will do what you always would have done in any given situation. So the easiest way to understand this is to understand the rewind the world thought experiment. So imagine you make a decision. I don't know where you're going to go on a holiday. You're thinking Australia, Brazil, Australia, Brazil. I'm going to go to Australia. So I choose A and not B, right? So you then carry on living for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour, whatever, it doesn't matter. And then you rewind to that exact point in time, right? So at that exact point, we call this a causal circumstance. At that exact point, right, everything in the universe is identical because actually it's the same universe. You rewound that same universe. It's not like we've got two universes. This is the same universe. Everything is identical down to the wave functions, every molecule hitting you, every bit of learning you've ever had before, all this kind of stuff. And the determinist says, well, everything's identical. You are going to choose to do the same thing. Like, how could you choose to do something else? What is affecting that decision so that you would make a different decision in the same scenario? So the determinist says, you're going to choose to do the same thing. The libertarian free willer will say, you could have done otherwise. In that identical scenario, you could have both chosen to go to Australia and in a very real and tangible way have chosen to go to Brazil on holiday. Both those things come out the exact same situation. Now, it doesn't matter whether in reality you can rewind the world. It doesn't matter whether quantum physics is going to mess around with the rewinding of the world. It's a thought experiment. It's irrelevant whether that is feasible, whether it is physically possible. So the rewinding of the world is a thought experiment to just take you back and imagine this scenario whereby you have every single um, element of the universe is identical, or it is not even identical. It is the same. It's just the same universe, but that you could choose one thing or another thing. That's the point of that thought experiment, and this is um, feeding into something called Laplace's demon. So Pierre Simon Laplace, who is a French mathematician and philosopher, he thought it was eventually called Laplace's demon. He didn't call it that. He thought of this kind of entity, this demon, if you like, that if it knew every aspect of the universe, every wave function, every causal variable, everything about the universe at any given point in time, that with all that knowledge, it could predict the next moment in time. It could predict the next instance of the universe. In other words, with the full knowledge of all variables, a bit like an omniscient God, you could know the future. You could just it kind of plays out like some deterministic mechanism. And of course, this is not to talk about quantum indeterminacy and all this kind of funky stuff. We'll get onto that in a second. But the idea is that Laplace's demon, in principle, could predict the universe, could predict the future, given the antecedent variables, those variables that come before the decision or the event. The compatibilist, right, is sort of a bit of one, certainly not the other, and tries to marry both ideas. So, in other words, that free will and determinism are compatible. Now, this sounds a bit weird because determinism kind of means no free will. So, how can you say no free will and free will are compatible? Well, actually, what happens here is they redefine that term free will. So I would call that libertarian free will. And the version of a compatibilist free will is usually something like the ability to do what you want. You have your volitions, your will, and as long as you're doing what you want, then that's free will. So as long as you're not, shackled in a cell with a gun against your head, right? That you don't have free will there, so the compatibilist believes. But if you're just walking around your daily life and you say, oh, I'm gonna have a cup of tea now, I've freely decided to have a cup of tea. What the compatibilist doesn't do is say, well, what about your desires? Were your desires themselves determined? It's kind of like stops kind of a few layers too early, in my opinion. Sometimes compatibilists are called soft determinists because they deny libertarian free will. It's like you are always going to do what you're going to do in the situation you find yourselves in. So the compatibilists and the hard determinists believe the same thing, that we don't have libertarian free will and we are going to do what we're going to do. But what they say is that it's still free will. We redefine free will and we say it's free will still because you're doing what you want. It doesn't matter that you can't decide your own desires. As long as you're doing what you want, that's good enough for us. So the compatibilists believe that. So ostensibly, compatibilists and determinists both deny libertarian free will. And as I say, compatibilists redefine that idea of free will, and determinists just say, no, I'm not having any of that. We live in this causally determined universe. I am both a hard determinist and a compatibilist. It's like if you want to define free will like that, sure, we got free will. But if you don't want to define it like that, then we don't have it. And both those positions deny libertarian free will, and that's the important part. So William James, for example, he's a great sort of psychologist, actually, and sort of philosopher, said that this is a quagmire of evasion because you're kind of redefining your terms. But actually, redefining terms is something that happens quite often in science. Laws of thermodynamics get kind of redefined and whatnot. Arthur Schopenhauer, as a philosopher, said, a man can do what he wills. Okay, so you can do what you want, brilliant. But he can't will what he wills. You can do what you want, but you can't decide to want what you want. What you want is itself determined. Your desires are themselves determined, and that's kind of where the hard determinist is. So hopefully that's a really simple explanation of those three positions. Now, statistically, what do philosophers believe? Well, this is referring to the 2009 Phil Papers survey. There's actually been another Phil Papers survey in 2020. I haven't looked at the results as much as I looked at the 2009 one. So the Phil Papers survey is the biggest survey of philosophers in the world, right? And they get loads of data on what philosophers believe. And from that survey, and the stats have changed slightly in the 2021, but not hugely. The 13.7% of philosophers believe in libertarian free will. 12% believe in no free will. So you might go, oh, hang on, libertarian free will is more popular than no free will. 14.9% other, there's always others, and 60% in compatibilists. Well, actually, I think the compatibilist number has now gone up. The point is that all of these three, well, I'm not too sure about the other, but no free will and compatibilist will deny libertarian free will. So actually 13.7% is on its own. Now, what's really interesting, and this is probably one of the last times I'll mention God, is that the metadata, when you look at the statistics for this survey, is that the people who believe in libertarian free will overwhelmingly believe in God. In other words, and I'll hopefully tell you that free will doesn't work, libertarian free will doesn't work, but people really need it to work, because if it doesn't work, then they can't believe in their version of a judgmental God. So it's for them, that's why you see this correlation. This correlation is borne out in the metadata of both that study and in fact the 2020 study. So the 2020 study is here, and it's really interesting that so here we've got accept or lean towards libertarianism, 12.81%, compatibilism, 62.81%, no free will, 10%, but I would add those two together, really. The 12.81% is the key one. There's not that much of a high percentage. And then when you look at the correlations, the people who believe in free will, there's a strong correlation with believing in God and believing in cosmological fine-tuning arguments and all sorts of stuff like that. So that is, I think, a pretty interesting finding that kind of goes along with the 2009 data as well. Anyway, there you go. So that's what people believe. There's also a correlation, interestingly, between people who believe in libertarian free will and people who believe in paranormal stuff. Uh, what that tells you, I guess, is open to debate. So let's move on to philosophical evidence. So causality. Causality is a really difficult thing to actually define. People still argue about what causality really is. I guess you don't need to know how it works other than it works, as in this antecedent causal variable takes place before this effect takes place. And there's something that links that to that. There you go. But we can talk about, you could talk about causality in far more deeper and drier philosophical terms, but I don't think we need to bog ourselves down with that in a moment. One thing about causality is that it is complex. And we think about billiard balls, right? We think about A causing B causing D, C causing D causing E, right? And this really simple linear understanding of causality. And that's, to be perfectly honest, just a load of bollocks. That's my philosophical terminology there. Really, causality is much more like a matrix. And here's a real thing that happened to me that explains this. So when I was a teacher many years back, I went on a school trip and I took kids on a school trip, and we went. We were a bit late leaving, and we had to absolutely paste it down to the ferry, to get across on a ferry to get to the other side, to a place called Portsmouth, and then go to the naval dockyard there to do the school trip. And because we're running behind, I was making everyone walk really, really, really fast, and we legged it down there. And I had some parent helpers with us, and one of them was pretty unhealthy. And he had to stop every so often for a bit of a smoke and whatever. This in the slightly older days. And anyway, we got down there, we had a day trip, and it was lovely. And then at the end, we actually had to paste it back. And my kids were really unfit. They weren't used to doing all this walking. And they're like, oh, this is the worst experience of my life type thing. And the dad of one of the kids was struggling a little bit as well. Anyway, it turns out that later that night, I heard news that he had a heart attack and died. And I was quite hit by this because I as you would, sat back and went, goodness me, was I causally responsible for the death of this guy? So he has, I've made him walk really quickly. That was, I made us do this, I made us do that. I was causally responsible for his death. And then I thought, no, hang on, that's really naive. That's a billiard ball. A equals B equals C equals D. The world doesn't work like that. And then you start looking at causality. It's like, okay, so if he had been healthier, would he have died? That was his choice, right? If he hadn't been a smoker, and then you start getting onto other questions, like if he had decided not to send his child to that school, okay, or his wife had said to him, maybe it's his wife's fault for not telling him, oh, you shouldn't go on that, you've got stuff to do around the house or whatever in that day. And you start working out that actually what caused him to, because you can map it back. You say, well, actually, we didn't have evolution working such that Homo sapiens evolved, then that would never have happened. So that's a necessary component. This is J.L. Mackie, a philosopher, said you have inus conditions, insufficient but necessary. It doesn't really matter. You have a bunch of conditions that work together that aren't themselves entirely necessary on their own, but together, So you have a fire that starts in a house, and it starts because someone flicked on a light switch, but the gas had been left on, and there was all this combustible stuff around, right? So what caused the fire? Well, it wouldn't have started if this light hadn't been switched on. So it's a person switched the light on. No, but it wouldn't have happened if someone hadn't left the gas on. So it's a person, but it wouldn't have happened if there wasn't combustible material all around, and so on and so forth. And actually, what you find out is that the fire started because of the entire universe up to that point, really, is where you get back to. So when you start talking about why did this guy die, you start thinking really big terms that, well, the reason that that man died was because the universe was in the way it was just before that event took place. And if we map it back, we get back to the sort of Big Bang. And this is forgetting things like quantum mechanics and stuff like that, and some interpretations of that. But the idea is that that causality, I would argue, is a big matrix of stuff happening all the time. But humans are very good at taking one piece out of that causal matrix and saying that thing was responsible for the next thing happening. And I think that's a really big problem. You can't just, some people call it sort of proximal causation. So you take the nearest thing and just go, well, that's what caused that. It's like, yeah, but what caused that nearest thing? Why are you drawing the line there and not further back? And then, of course, the further back you go, you get to the Big Bang. So that's, causality is a difficult and complex thing to like unpick. You get the idea. So Daniel Dennett, the philosopher, wrote the book. Which one was it? Freedom Evolves. One of his books. Anyway, he talks about free will, and he says, as a compatibilist, he said, well, actually, free will needs determinism. If you don't have determinism, you don't have causal variables for things happening. It looks like random. So if you want to take responsibility over a decision, you have to understand all that causation involved in that decision, and you have to take ownership by actually being causally involved in that. But you kind of need to understand a wider matrix of causality. So free will needs causation to make any sense. Otherwise, it just looks like random. Um, I just want to say thanks so much to Chindi Chimbalu, who's already a member of the channel. What a legend. Thank you, JP. Learned a lot on the differences. I have something to challenge people at Bible study next time they speak about libertarian free will. Well, hopefully you'll learn some more as well as we go through this. And thank you so much, Chindi. You're such a generous, decent human being. Thank you. So the thing is, as soon as you start saying, well, this happened because of that and that happened because of that behind it, you are inviting in determinism, right? And this is what libertarian free willers don't like. So you can formulate this into a logical syllogism if you're that kind of person. Some person, quite an agent, at some time could have acted otherwise than she did. Actions are events. Every event has a cause. If an event is caused, then it is causally determined. If an event is an act that is causally determined, then the agent of the act could not have acted otherwise than in the way that she did. Ergo, we don't have free will. But you can pick holes in in the labeling and the language used there, but let's not dwell on that. The question is, what would it take for us to have free will? What would it look like if we had free will? Well, the first thing that's really important is you have to be the originator of a causal chain. And Chindi, this might be interesting for you because what people who are I said I wouldn't speak about God, but here it goes again. What people who believe in God believe is that quite often they use what's called the prime mover argument. So the prime mover argument is that God is the only entity that can be the beginning of a causal chain, right? The prime mover is like, why did that happen? Why did that happen? Why did that happen? Why did that happen? And you get back to, for theists, you get back to God. Now, the theist says, because, the atheist sometimes says, well, what caused God? And what caused that? And what caused that? And so the theist says, nothing caused God. It's a necessary entity, and therefore it's just the originator of a causal chain. And they use this prime mover argument to say the only thing that can be the originator of a causal chain is God, and therefore God started the universe. What caused the Big Bang? God, and you can't go further back than God. Okay, fair enough. If you want that argument, I mean, I disagree with that completely because I wrote a book on that called Did God Create the Universe from Nothing? Countering William Lane Craig's Clown Cosmological Argument. So that's a book that counters that argument, but let's grant that for the theist, right? And they say, okay, so God is the only prime mover. And this is a fairly accepted bit of theistic philosophy by theists, right? And say, but if you want free will, and this is where the Christians, so Chindi, this is an interesting one for you. So most Christians will then go, and other theists who believe in libertarian free will say, okay, when you have a causal chain that goes back and back, so this happened because this happened, and then you get back to the agent, right? So say me, right? What the libertarian free willer wants to do is say, I am entirely the originator of that causal chain. I have to be for free will to work, because if you can say I did that because of this and take that chain further back, then you are inviting in determinism, right? So the libertarian free willer has to go, you can't take that chain further back because we can't have determinism. Otherwise, we're just going to go back to the Big Bang and there isn't anything like free will. So in order for the agent to have free will, for me to have free will, I have to be the originator of a causal chain. But the theist has just said over there that the only originator of a causal chain is God. God can be the only prime mover. And yet at the same time, they often say that every single agent in the universe who is acting freely is the originator of a causal chain. And you're like, okay, you cannot have a prime mover argument like the Kalam cosmological argument. You cannot have a prime mover argument and a libertarian free will argument where we're the originator of the causal chain. Those two don't work together. So that's an interesting sidebar. Some people sometimes say that it's consciousness or it's a soul, or they plug in some kind of magic entity that does a job of free will. But that doesn't really help, right? It doesn't explain anything. We still have to explain how causality is working here, how something is freely chosen. And the problem is that libertarian free will looks like random. It looks identical to random if you can't allow any causal determinants or causal variables to be part of the decision. So if I'm deciding whether to go to Australia or Brazil, right? Now, the libertarian free willer wants me to have that entire causal circumstance and be the originator of that decision. But if I say, well, I chose Australia because actually I've got family out there and I've always liked Australia, and there's some of my favorite sports done in Australia, and I absolutely love the wildlife there, and I watch this show and I really like that, and I don't like Brazil because of this, and I don't like Brazil because of that, and I give you all these reasons, right? Those are causal determinants. Those are parts of my life that have happened to me before, experiences I've had with Australia and Brazil that I'm bringing to the decision. In other words, I can start mapping the decision further back behind me causally to other experiences I've had and to other independent variables. And that's a real problem because the free willer wants me not to be able to do that. They want me entirely to have this decision inside of me without these causal determinants and causal variables. But the problem is, in order for me to have that inside me and to be the originator of this causal chain, it looks absolutely identical to random. If you're saying there can be no other causal variables and determinants working on this because that's determinism, then all you're left with is something that is uncaused. And the only way of understanding something that's uncaused is random. And there's just no way of getting around that. And that's the key problem to libertarian free will, just there. That is your key argument, in my opinion, against free will. So there you go. That's just what I've said there on that sort of slide, always logically leading back to a first cause, and then we can talk about, well, how did the Big Bang happen? That's where it all gets pretty interesting. But the idea is you just, with causal determinism, you keep mapping it back and back and back and back. It's worth mentioning, I don't know, really should have looked at this PowerPoint a lot more earlier. I've had a busy day. So quantum, it doesn't really help here. It doesn't help the libertarian free willer at all. Some people try and make it help, but quantum indeterminacy. So say something is random at the quantum level. So say you've got some I don't know, event in your brain that is a result of quantum indeterminacy where you're like, don't, right? That doesn't allow me to have ownership over that decision, right? If my decision was based partly on random causation going on at the microscopic level, then that doesn't help free will. It just means that you're introducing random into the decision making process. Likewise, if you've got like quantum indeterminacy all throughout the universe and things work in probabilistic ways, but not in strict Newtonian physics of causality at the subatomic level, it doesn't help free will. It may disprove determinism, and it depends how you interpret free will. So lots of ways, quantum. There are lots of ways of interpreting quantum, and some of them are deterministic. There's some interesting science that's just been done, talk about non-locality and all this stuff that a lot of people think indicate a non-deterministic understanding of the universe. However, I think the jury is still out, but it doesn't really matter. The key here is that neither quantum indeterminism or hard determinism help free will. They are both, and this is why sometimes you hear the term hard incompatibilism. Okay, to understand those positions. Anyway, I had to clear out that quantum. So, in order for you to have done something different, so if you're going to say, right, I chose Australia, but actually in that causal circumstance, I could have chosen Brazil. Right. In order for you to say that and for it to make any kind of sense, you have to change something about the causal circumstance. You have to tinker with some variable that's going on there for me to choose Brazil and not Australia. Because otherwise, if everything's identical, if all the way that I weight up the arguments, if all my experiences prior to that decision were identical, then what could cause me to choose differently other than I did that first time? There is nothing that can choose me to that can cause me to choose differently unless it's one random, some kind of randomness in my decision making process that suddenly I'm choosing Brazil, but that doesn't really help my free will. It doesn't give me like moral responsibility over that decision if it's largely random or partially random or whatever. And the only other way you can get me to choose Brazil, given that all the variables are identical, is to have some of those variables or one of those variables being different, which is you change the decision if you change the causal circumstance, but you still have some kind of determinism working there. So it's still really difficult to understand how you can get libertarian free will. So I'm just going to take a quick drink because my I've been doing a lot of talking. Let's look at a couple of live questions before we go on to some scientific evidence. Thanks for hanging out, Lee. I appreciate that. Cheryl, good to see you here. Somebody tried to tell me a war started in Ukraine under Obama. No war started under Trump. A war started in Ukraine under Biden. If Trump had been president, no war. V versus strong, a fallacy. Nothing to do with free will, Cheryl. However, what gets quite interesting when you talk about things like that is who was responsible for doing X or Y. You start, and I wrote an article on this actually, talking about that. Actually, technically, if you drop this understanding of libertarian free will, you should start dropping things like anger. Because you're like, well, you did that because you're the person you are in the situation you're in, and we can't affect what's happened in the past. And so if I understand you and understand all these causal variables, I understand why you did that. And you know, for a criminal, if we understand all the variables that went into your, you know, life choices and your situation, then we can understand why you ended up doing that antisocial behavior. Then actually, what that should do is it should stop us getting angry with you because I understand why you did that now. What I need to do is try and, you know, treat you in a humane way so you don't do that again and try and work towards making other people not do that type thing. But so the idea is that you should drop anger. But the thing is, I understand this as a philosopher, you know, fully, but I still get angry with my children and I still get angry with people like Trump, right? So because I'm a lefty liberal. But and I recognize that I'm having double standards there because on the one hand I'm saying, you know, we don't have free will and we shouldn't get angry, we should try and understand why people act in the way that they do in the situation they're in. And yet on the other hand I go, oh, you idiot, oh, I hate the way you've done that. And when my child does things that really annoy me, or my children do things that really annoy me, then I get angry with them, and then I have to catch myself going, come on, you preach about this in, you know, you just got double standards. And these are what philosopher P.F. Strawson called reactive attitudes. He ended up saying, like, we don't have free will, but because we have these strong reactive attitudes in us that are psychological reactions to these situations that we've evolved over time, because they're so difficult to shape, we just can't shape them. He talked about praiseworthiness and blameworthiness. So he said we have the tendency to praise people and to blame them given these different situations, and we can't shake that. So we might as well live like free will exists, you know, sort of free will illusionism. He added sort of compatibilism, where he said libertarian free will doesn't exist, but we've got these strong reactive attitudes, so let's just live in this particular way. So you can get free will illusionists, and I guess I'm a bit of that, which is half of my day I do go through the day just assuming we've got free will. It's just how you lived your life. But yeah, There you go. Anyway, let's look at some psychological and neuroscientific evidence. Loads. I've cherry picked. I'm not cherry picked. I've arbitrarily picked some evidence. Just there's so much evidence. Because, and here's something that's worth laying out here. Both psychology and science in general uh, almost necessitate a causal understanding of the world. So when you try and do science, the scientific understanding of reality is to say, okay, we've got some data here. What caused that data? So what you're doing is you're saying, okay, we have causation and we have cause and effect. Science is a project to understand cause and effect with everything, right? That's the scientific project. So it's really difficult to do science and then go, but free will. Yeah, what caused that? They just chose to do that. It's just them choosing that. Yeah, but why do they choose to do that? Oh, I can't answer that because you can't get a causal determinant in there like a why. I can't answer that why. It's just they freely chose it. The same with imagine being having a problematic behavior, right, and going to see a psychiatrist. So I don't know, Lee Dixon there, he's got some problematic behavior, and he goes to see his psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist says, "Come sit down on the chaise longue." And Lee lies back and says, "Right." And the psychiatrist says, "Oh, okay, explain to me what's happened." And he said, Lee says, "Oh, I do this and that." And the psychiatrist says, "Well, did you freely choose to do that?" And Lee says, "Yeah, I freely chose to do that." The psychiatrist doesn't go, "Well, that's that then. It was your free will. It was your free will that did it. Thank you very much. It's $150, please. Thank you, Lee. See you later. That was a great session." No, a psychiatrist and a psychologist, what they do is they seek to understand causality within our psychology and our psyche, which is to say, okay, you had this problematic behavior. Let's understand why you did that. What was it about your past? What is about your behaviors, your learned behaviors? Can we unlearn some of those behaviors? Can we understand the trauma in your past, or this in your past, or that in your past that led you to have this behavior? So psychology and science in general are are predicated upon this understanding that the world works to cause and effect. And if you suddenly go, it's free will what did it, then you're throwing away cause and effect, and science and psychology suddenly can't work because you're just saying, well, you freely chose it, and that's a real problem. Um, anyway, I'm going to now play you a little bit, and I'd like uh, you to let me know if you can hear the sound. If you can't hear the sound, I'm going to be almightily annoyed. So this is a few minutes of a guy called David Pizarro, who's a political psychologist, and this is the idea that when we think about why we are political in the way we think that's the most rational we're being. We sit down and we go, yeah, I'm this kind of political person, or I believe in this kind of politics or this policy. I'm being really rational. And it turns out that actually our political behavior is really predictable and is arguably predicated on other causal variables underneath that. And an interesting sidebar here, talk about religion again. Another sidebar here is that it turns out that political psychology is a layer below, it seems, religion. So we think that, oh, we're religious and that's the most rational I'm being. I'm choosing to believe this thing, this kind of belief system. But it turns out there's loads of data that's coming out now to show that people do what's called church shopping. Now, church shopping is you go to a church, right, and you go, God, I don't like this pastor. He's not politically aligned with me. But instead of adapting your politics to fit your religion, your politics are kind of set in stone, and you adapt your religious content to fit your politics. So you go to a church that fits your politics rather than you adapt your politics to fit your church and you stay at that church. In other words, it looks like political psychology is more fundamental than religious psychology or religious belief. And that's a really interesting bunch of data that's starting to come out now. Because believers often think that they are the most, this is the most rational and it's all yada, yada, yada. Not necessarily. Okay. Now, this is talking about political psychology having other causation below that. And David Pizarro has done a bunch of research into disgust sensitivity. I won't show you all the disgust sensitivity bit, but just to explain that, that is like your predisposition to be disgusted by something. And there's lots of physical things like the smell, feel, taste, vision. They've done loads of different experiments to say that, okay, you are really easily disgusted. And you're not that easily disgusted. And then they look at their political dispositions, and it turns out that political conservatism, so conservatives are far more easily disgusted, that they have a high disgust sensitivity than liberals. And it turns out that liberals, it's much more difficult to disgust liberals. They're not as easily offended by smells and sounds and visions and things like that. And that's really interesting. And then they've looked at it in a lab setting, and then they've gone out and looked at it actually in a wider political world. So I'm going to play you a bit of his TED talk that he gave that I think is a really nice describer. Can you please let me know if you can hear this? Oh, no, I haven't even got it right yet. So, oops. Oh, I've messed that up, haven't I, already? I'm going to get that back. Right. Yeah, this is where I'd normally say I would cut this out of my video. Right. Uh, let's try that again, shall we, without being so thick? Here we go. Right. Can you hear this?
The first time that we set out to collect data on this and associate it with political or moral beliefs, we found a general pattern. This is with the psychologists Yoel Inbar and Paul Bloom, that in fact, across 3 studies, we kept finding that people who reported that they were easily disgusted also reported that they were more politically conservative. Another way to say this, though, is that people who are very liberal are very hard to disgust. In a more recent follow-up study, we were able to look at a much larger sample. In this case, this is nearly 30,000 US respondents. And we find the same pattern. As you can see, people who are on the very conservative side of answering the political orientation scale are also much more likely to report that they're easily disgusted. This data set also allowed us to statistically control for a number of things that we knew were both related to political orientation and to disgust sensitivity. So we were able to control for gender, age, income, education, even basic personality variables, and the result stays the same. When we actually looked at not just self-reported political orientation, but voting behavior, we were able to look geographically across the nation. What we found was that in regions in which people reported high levels of disgust sensitivity, McCain got more votes. So it not only predicted self-reported political orientation, but actual voting behavior. And also we were able, with this sample, to look across the world, 121 different countries. We asked the same questions. And as you can see, this is 121 countries collapsed into 10 different geographical regions. No matter where you look, what this is plotting is the size of the relationship between disgust sensitivity and political orientation. And no matter where we looked, we saw a very similar effect. Other labs have actually looked at this as well using different measures of disgust sensitivity. So rather than asking people how easily disgusted they are, they hook people up to physiological measures, in this case, skin conductance. And what they've demonstrated is that people who report being more politically conservative are also more physiologically aroused when you show them disgusting images like the ones that I showed you. Interestingly, what they also showed, and a finding that we kept getting in our previous studies as well, was that one of the strongest influences here is that individuals who are very disgust sensitive not only are more likely to report being politically conservative, but they're also very much more opposed to gay marriage and homosexuality and pretty much a lot of the socio-moral issues in the sexual domain.
So what's really interesting here, and I'm going to play a few more minutes of that because it is fascinating, is the link between moral evaluation and where political is moral, right, just on a larger scale, but where you've got moral evaluation being causally linked to your physiology, right? So you're saying that this is bad because I've been primed and I'm feeling disgusted, physically disgusted about something, and there's a connection between morality and political evaluation and physiology and disgust sensitivity.
So physiological arousal predicted in this study attitudes toward gay marriage. But even with all these data linking disgust sensitivity and political orientation, one of the questions that remains is, what is the causal link here? Is it the case that disgust really is shaping political and moral beliefs? We have to resort to experimental methods to answer this. And so what we can do is actually bring people into the lab and discuss them and compare them to a control group that hasn't been disgusted. It turns out that over the past 5 years, a number of researchers have done this. And by and large, the results have all been the same, that when people are feeling disgust, their attitudes shift toward the right end of the political spectrum, toward more moral conservatism as well. So this is whether you use a foul odor, a bad taste from film clips, from post-hypnotic suggestions of disgust, images like the ones I've shown you, even just reminding people that disease is prevalent and they should be wary of it and wash up, right, to keep clean. These all have similar effects on judgment. Let me just give you an example from a recent study that we conducted. We asked participants to just simply give us their opinion of a variety of social groups. And we either made the room smell gross or not. When the room smelled gross, what we saw was that individuals actually reported more negative attitudes toward gay men. Disgust didn't influence attitudes toward all the other social groups that we asked, including African Americans, the elderly. It really came down to the attitudes that they had toward gay men. In another set of studies, we actually simply reminded people, this was at a time when the swine flu was going around, we reminded people that in order to prevent the spread of the flu, that they ought to wash their hands. For some participants, we actually had them take questionnaires next to a sign that reminded them to wash their hands. And what we found was that just taking a questionnaire next to this hand sanitizing reminder made individuals report being more politically conservative. Right?
Wow.
And when we asked them a variety of questions about the rightness or wrongness of certain acts, what we also found was that simply being reminded that they ought to wash their hand made them more morally conservative. In particular, when we asked them questions about sort of taboo but fairly harmless sexual practices, just being reminded that they ought to wash their hand made them think that they were more morally wrong. Let me give you an example of what I mean by harmless but
trigger warning in case you're sensitive to weird sexual things here.
Taboo sexual practice. We gave them scenarios. One of them said a man is house sitting for his grandmother. When his grandmother's away, he has sex with his girlfriend on his grandma's bed. In another one, we said a woman enjoys masturbating with her favorite teddy bear cuddled next to her. People find these to be more morally abhorrent if they've been reminded to wash their hands.
So that's all I'm going to show you. That, I mean, it's just really fascinating. But the idea is that we think we're always being rational and we're using our rational faculties, but there are so many things going on underneath those top layers. Our consciousness, there's so much that's going on physiologically, all these variables that hang us, the fact that a smell could lead us to have a more negative moral evaluation of something or someone is fascinating. And the connection there between physiology and moral evaluation is a really interesting one. I think just some really fascinating bits of work. Other random bits of psychology to bring to bear here. So correlation of any behavior against personality types. This is really interesting, actually. Any sociological or any data that you ever see. So, for example, like 27% of men, men are more likely to do this than women, or I don't know, people from Britain are more likely to do this than people from China, or I don't know, disabled people are more likely to do this, or someone with Parkinson's is more likely to do this, whatever. If you're saying that a certain subset of humanity is more likely or less likely to have some kind of behavioral trait than the rest of humanity, you are saying straight away behavior is at least influenced by causal variables, and that straight away you are constraining the ability to have libertarian free will. And our world is full of that data. The data is just so much data, it's almost impossible to know what to pick out to talk to you about. I mean, I picked some absolutely random ones just because they're quite interesting. So implicit egotism is quite fun. This is the idea that actually when we look at other people and try and evaluate them, we're quite egotistical, and we have this implicit egotism that affects our judgment of other people. Rasputin. So they've done this exercise with morally evaluating Rasputin by reading through an account of what he did and everything. But and you kind of rate him as evil out of 10. I don't know. I'm kind of butchering the research here. So say you morally evaluate Rasputin 8 out of 10, but it gives it in his bio. They changed the date of birth for the so the control group just reads the normal stuff and they rate Rasputin, and then the test group gets the date of birth of Rasputin changed to your own date of birth. You read it and then you morally evaluate Rasputin as nicer than you would have morally evaluated him otherwise, just because he's got the same birthday as you. So that kind of thing. Or there's actually statistically significant amount of people who marry other people with the same initials as them. Or the great interesting one to do with tea. And again, tasting tea. How do you evaluate this tea out of 10? And if the tea so if it's Lapsu Chong tea, right? Say oh, like 7 out of 10. But if I say, and I'm going to pick, I don't know, Cheryl Watley here. If I say, oh, this is Shai Wan tea, and I give her that, she's more likely to rate that as a better tasting tea because it's got the initials SW, which are her initials. And so this is that implicit egotism that is working all the time in the way that we evaluate other things and look for ourselves in that. You get things like the mere exposure effect. This is how advertising works, which is Coke, Coca-Cola. Oh, what am I going to drink? Coke, because you've seen it like it's in your face. This is how actually something called the illusion of truth effect works. Very similar sort of subliminal messaging, which is, I remember when during Brexit, and I'm not going to make a comment on Brexit or anything, but during Brexit in the UK, 2016, Nigel Farage was on the TV all the time, and there's this who was a real pro-Brexiteer, and there's this thing that says, any publicity is good publicity, and it's absolutely correct. So the illusion of truth effect is the more you see something and the more you hear it, and this is why Trump getting on TV all the time before his election was the best thing for him, because the more you hear something and the more you see something, the more credible that thing becomes, even if it's ridiculous. So even if they've done loads of research now on Facebook to show how fake news spreads 5 times quicker than real news. But what's behind this is that the more you see something, the more credible it becomes. So if you see something that's complete nonsense on Facebook, but you see it like 10 times a day, and you're seeing it for every day for a month, then eventually that thing is more credible. It's a bit like the Overton window. You kind of shift what you think is acceptable. So these things are acting on you all the time. There's a really interesting thing about gut feeling and intuition. So gut feeling is so you in the Second World War, you used to have plane spotters who would look up and work out in Britain whether that was a German bomber or a German fighter or a UK fighter or British fighter, and they to then go and tell people to shoot up at that and whatnot. And it turns out that they became, you had plane spotters who were really very good. Same with chicken sexers. You get people that can sex a chicken really easily, but actually they don't really know what they're doing. Like they don't have a conscious understanding of what it is that differentiates the female from the male chicken. But their non-conscious brain is able to do that. It's just that their conscious brain cannot then post hoc rationalize that. This is called post hoc rationalization, where you add rationality after the fact, because they just don't do that. Or we do that, and it's called post hoc rationalization, but it's like added on afterwards, and it's not actually what defined that decision in the first place. So our non-conscious brains do an enormous amount of work, and quite often we celebrate that work by adding intention afterwards and saying, oh look, that was we consciously decided to do that, and that was all our consciousness. But actually it was our non-conscious brain doing it. And there's some really good examples of this as well. There's a 3-deck card of games. So the 3-deck card of games is like there's a pattern to how something works, and it turns out that humans can, on average, can find out the pattern after the 25th round of this kind of game, right? But the really interesting thing is that your non-conscious brain, and they've worked this out through skin conductance tests and all sorts of other things, your non-conscious brain has actually worked it out by the 13th round, and then your conscious brain catches up on the 25th round and adds on that intention and says, oh look how wonderful I am, I've worked that out. It was your actual non-conscious brain that did it much earlier. And the later conscious development is after the fact, which is a fascinating thing. So there's a theory in philosophy called epiphenomenalism. Epiphenomenalism is the idea that your consciousness is like, you know, when you boil a kettle, the steam is the necessary byproduct of boiling the kettle. But it could be that our consciousness is a necessary byproduct of our brain's machinations. The consciousness isn't the jockey on the horse riding the horse and directing the horse, but the horse is directing the rider. It's just the rider thinks he's in charge. So there's an argument to say that our consciousness isn't actually in charge of what we do, but is just following along and adding intention afterwards. So I think now I've been speaking for 55 minutes, right? I haven't chosen, like, all the words I know in the world, all the words I know in the world, each word, next word, I'm not choosing that next word and going, right, of all the words I know, that's the next one I'm going to say. That's the next, they're just coming out. And sometimes I listen to myself speak and go, oh, hell, that's pretty good. So who's doing the speaking? Is it my conscious brain? Am I choosing to say these things? Or is my conscious brain actually listening to what I'm saying and then going, oh, yeah, brilliant. Well done. That makes sense. So epiphenomenalism is a really, really interesting position. Lots of other things I could talk about. Gut feeling. So the idea of gut feeling and intuition. So I would argue intuition, when we have intuition, is actually our non-conscious brain doing calculations. We go, oh, I just intuitively felt that. No, actually, your consciousness doesn't know how you came up with that because it was a calculations done by your non-conscious brain. That was doing the hard work, and then your consciousness goes, oh, I just had a gut feeling, I just had an intuition, I knew that would happen. No, so you might look at someone and say, oh, I don't trust that guy, I've got a gut feeling, I've got an intuition, I don't trust that guy. Actually, your non-conscious brain is looking at loads of markers on that person's face and body and body language, and is reading that and going back into the files from your entire life and saying, well, last time we saw someone like that happened, the last time, blah 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 blah. Okay, I don't think I trust that guy. He's got some pretty dodgy looking aspects to him. And then you say, I had a gut feeling, I just had an intuition. I just had an intuition is doing a disservice, arguably, to your non-conscious brain that's putting in that legwork and computing for you. Another thing that's interesting, and this has loads of ramifications throughout life, actually, in predicting behavior thereafter. So Walter Mischel did the famous marshmallow experiment or cookie experiment, where he developed, and this has been replicated loads of times, and has been shown to have effect in loads of other life areas. But he basically came up with the experiment where you get kids, young kids, like 5-year-old kids or whatever. You sit them down and say, right, here's a cookie. You like cookies, right? Here's a cookie. Now, I'm going to go away because I've just got something to do, but I'll be back. If that cookie is there when I get back, I'll give you 2 cookies. So you get extra reward if that cookie is still there. So the experimenter goes away for a long time, or an amount of time, whatever, and then comes back. And they measure the children that ate the cookie and the children didn't. And they use some kids that don't eat it, use loads of mechanisms, sit on their hands, rock around, do loads of stuff, blah, 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 blah. But the interesting stuff is the correlation or causation, arguably, between the children who choose not to eat the cookie to get a reward. It's called delayed gratification. You delay your gratification. And they choose not to do that. And then they look at their life skills. So they follow them longitudinally for like a couple of decades or whatever, and say that actually they did better in their SAT scores, they did better at this, they did better at that. So the children who can delay their gratification have a much greater chance of succeeding in later life. And the children who struggle with delayed gratification, eat the cookie straight away, much more likely to have a higher body mass index, much more likely to do, X, Y, and Z, not do so well in their exams, and all sorts of things. And you can actually make predictions back from when they were this young. And in fact, there's another really good experiment that Adrian Raine did and I forget his colleague in Mauritius, and they followed again longitudinal study. If you ever want to get a really good book, get Adrian Raine's The Anatomy of Violence. It's just amazing. But anyway, so he did an experiment, looked at fear conditioning. So fear conditioning is like if your fear manifests itself, in your like sweat or your heart rate goes up or whatever, right? And they looked at fear conditioning in 5-year-olds, I think it was. think it was 5-year-olds, and they said, oh, okay, these kids are not very good. They have very low fear condition. These kids are, blah blah blah. And then they looked at them 20 years later, and 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 they could predict the criminality really quite accurately. Criminality of these human beings at the age of 5 to whether they have a criminal record at the age of 21. And that's fascinating. So the ability to, and it kind of makes sense. If you don't feel scared, you've got nothing vetoing you. You're like, oh, I better not do that because my heart's getting up and I'm starting to sweat. And those are the sort of things that stop you doing things, right? But when we talk about a criminal at the age of 21 who's done this stuff, like it's quite important to understand, well, actually, they didn't have the natural veto things, the biological mechanisms in place, such as fear conditioning, that would act as a veto to stop them doing these kind of antisocial things. Anyway, stuff like that, all this kind of experimental data ends up telling you something. And I've talked about, we have this habit of inventing intention afterwards. So they've done some work on split brain. People have had their brain hemispheres severed, and they can't sort of make connections between certain things. And one of the interesting ones is, so it's to do with the right hand side of the brain and the left eye, and the right eye and the left hand side of the brain, and stuff like that. So they show things to one side of them. So they'll flash up Coke, 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 and they don't. The subject doesn't realize they're seeing like Coke, 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 and then they stand up and walk out the experimenter's van, and the experimenters go, hey, where are you going, what are you doing? And they say, oh, do you know what, this makes me really thirsty, this kind of work. I'm just going to go and get a can of Coke. And so what's happened is they've had a stimulus, and that has prompted them to do something. And then after the fact, they've invented intention. So this goes back to that epiphenomenalism thing I was talking about, which is to say that we're really good. We know there are loads of situations where we invent intention after we've done something and use that to justify behavior we had already committed to. But it wasn't the desire. So he didn't desire to have cut. He didn't actually go, oh, this is made. He didn't sit back and go, do you know what? I'm genuinely thirsty. This work is making me thirsty. I'm going to go and get Coke. It was the mere exposure effect. Coke, Coke, Coke. Over in one side, that part of his brain was not able to register, and then his non-conscious brain said basically, we're going to go and get a Coke, and then the conscious brain goes, what are we doing? Going to get a Coke, and then invents a story, a narrative that then is shoved in before the decision to do that action, or at least it's perceived as being before. So that's interesting. There are loads of other things like that. Here's an example of someone finding this out back in 1889. So this was Moll, it's Alfred Moll. Interesting, he was, I think, a psychologist, but also a sexologist. So interesting job. So he said, I tell a hypnotized, is a quote from his work, I tell a hypnotized subject that when he wakes up, he is to take a flower pot from the window, wrap it in cloth, put it on the sofa, and bow to it 3 times. All of which he does. When he is asked for his reasons, he answers, when I woke and saw the flower pot there, I thought that it was rather cold. The flower pot had better be warmed a little, or else the plant would die. So I wrapped it in a cloth, and then I thought that as the sofa was near the fire, I would put the flower pot on it, and I bowed because I was pleased with myself for having such a bright idea. He added that he did not consider the proceeding foolish because he had told me his reasons for so acting. In other words, this guy was hypnotized and told to do something, and then woken up, and he ended up doing that. But because he didn't have any intentions for why he did that, or any desires that he was conscious of, he then invented a narrative and thought that was completely plausible, and actually thought that was what made him do that, rather than the fact that he was hypnotized to do it. And again, what this suggests is that we're really good at inventing narratives after we are committed to doing things. In other words, our conscious minds are perhaps post hoc rationalizations, after the fact, narrative building of what our non-conscious brain is already committing to. That's an interesting thought. Can I just say thanks to Lee Dixon, who is a ledge. Thank you, Lee, and that's really kind. I really appreciate that. That's allows me to keep doing this, and this is the stuff I love. So I really appreciate that, Lee. Super generous. Um, okay, so a bit more psychology. It's just ways that our free will don't work in a way that maybe we think they do or think it does. Free will, so de-individualization from group psychology. This is like one person walks down the road and smashes a bus stop. You're like, why do you do that? And then you start thinking, oh, I was angry. Okay, two people walk down and do it. It was him. No, it was him. Five people walk down the road and they're all a bit rowdy and they all kind of a bit get egging each other on and end up sort of breaking the bus stop. And then afterwards, you try and break apart this causality. And it's almost like what I was saying before, when it gets so complicated, you're like, well, I only did it because he did. And he says, I only did it because she did. And then in the end, you have a loss of individual um, responsibility and causality in any given thing because you're lost in this group. And then you start getting those groups bigger and bigger and you start looking at nations and stuff, and it's just an interesting idea of how moral responsibility might be much more difficult to unpick when you have multiple people involved and you lose that sense of I. But other things, like I talked before about any kind of subset of people, so autistic people are less likely to believe in God. Turns out that, or certain autistic people, I should say, certain types, men are less likely to believe in God than women. The question is, well, the question can be, well, why is that? I'm interested. But the idea is that something is at play there that is not your free will. Something is working in your environment that is leading you towards that belief. That there's something about the environment or something about our biology that means that men are less likely to believe in God than women. There you go. It's just the fact that there is this data. And as I say, scientific, all data is, that's what's presupposed in science, is like you're looking for cause and effect. I've talked about the three deck game of cards. Psychology, biology, neuroscience, genetics. This is all looking at cause and effect in these dimensions. You've got the Benjamin Libet experiments. These are really famous. This is the idea that you press a button and you're conscious. You basically have a way of being able to know exactly when you consciously wanted to press a button and press a button, right? And they've done loads of experiments on this, and they worked out there's something called a readiness potential, which is to say that when you consciously, so you say, I consciously decided to press a button at this point, right? It turns out your brain had already geared up to pressing the button before you consciously had decided to press a button. In other words, it goes back to this idea before, which is that your conscious brain is just catching up with your non-conscious brain and is adding a narrative. The Benjamin Libet experiments are super famous. Some people say it disproves free will. I don't think so myself. I think it doesn't necessarily get it. That's more about automatic pressing and stuff rather than like deciding where to go on holiday. So I think there are different things going on, but I think they're really interesting and very useful for understanding what's going on with our consciousness and whether our non-conscious brain is doing the work. There's also transcortical magnetic stimulation that's very interesting. So you can have magnets that send magnetic pulses into your brain, and you can actually change people's moral evaluations. So this is where you think, oh, I'm being so rational. Look at me. Look at, some people might say my consciousness, my soul, and all this is deciding to do that. But the idea is that our consciousness or our minds are dependent on our brains. And we know that because if we're tired, we think differently. If we're ill, if we take drugs, if we're hungry, if I stick a fork in my eye and into my brain, I'm going to have a different sort of consciousness and a different state of mind, right? In other words, our brains, so from our brains emerge the mind. So this is a mind-body problem. But I would say that the mind 100% supervenes on, which is a funky way of saying depends on the brain. And that dependence can be seen by all the examples I've just taught you. And they first found this out with a guy called Phineas Gage back 100 and whatever years ago. And he was working on a railway line and got a pole through his brain and through his head, and actually survived, right? So this guy survived, and this is the first, but his personality entirely changed. It completely changed. And this is when they first realized, hang on, our personalities might be dependent upon what goes on in our brain. Like, this is a really good bit of data, and this started coming out from there. A really interesting case, a very famous case now, of a guy who started developing, just a regular dad, started developing pedophile tendencies. It's a very famous case. Lots have been done on this. And this was like, he freaked out about this because he knew it was wrong, and he was like, so he went to see a doctor. Anyway, the long and short of it is, it turns out he had a brain tumor, and the brain tumor was acting on him, and it changed his brain such that he started getting paedophile tendencies. They took the tumor out successfully, and those tendencies disappeared. So that's fascinating. And what's even more fascinating is that sometime later, I can't remember the time lapse, but sometime later, he started getting paedophile tendencies again. And he was like, oh, I think I know what's happening. And went back into the doctors, and like, it's happening again. It turns out the tumor had relapsed, had come back, and they had to take the tumor out again. But this is to say that our behaviors arguably are dependent on the structures of our body, and that includes our genes, but also our biology. So we have our genotype, which is our genetic blueprint, and out of our genotype comes our phenotype, which is our set of behaviors and traits, simplistically speaking. And you mess around with the genes, you're going to get different behaviors, but also you mess around with the environment, you're going to get different behaviors, because it's the interaction of your genes and your biology and your genes, and your biology is kind of your environment, and your outside environment, and all of these things interact together to give you human behavior. Now, so much data. What can I talk to you about? I can talk to you about twin studies from King's College London that show that your attainment in science is about 58% genetic, if I'm getting this right. Maths is about 56% genetic, and English is about 52% genetic. And I can tell you as a teacher, this pans out. So much pressure is put on teachers. Like, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, you've got to get the kids up to here. It turns out that actually schools and shared environment are only 29% responsible for attainment. In other words, you take a kid to the worst school you can, they're going to do this well. You take them to the best school that you can, they're going to do this well. And that difference is only about 30%, or in fact, less than that, because it's school and shared environment. So it'll be in the 20s, 20 something percent. There's a difference between a good school and a really bad school and a good school. And yet there the people get hammered. It turns out the genetics is responsible for double that, broadly speaking. And you know that as a teacher. So you look at your most challenged kid in your class who's got, like, learning disabilities and all this kind of stuff, right? And you say, right, I know that if I take that child and put them into any school in the local area, they are going to struggle. And if you took your brightest kid, your most motivated kid, the kid that really wants to learn, has got high aspirations, and they talk about high aspiration coming from your parents. So you got a high aspiration kid, you take him out of your class and you put him in any school in the local area, he's broadly going to do fairly well. There will be some variability, but the point is that actually far more of your attainment is genetic than it is about the quality of the school that you're at. So people don't like hearing about that, because the thing that we can affect is a school. So the governments can't affect people's genetics, and they struggle to affect people's social environments. So they go to the thing they can affect, which is a school, how you teach, standard of your teachers, what goes on in the classroom. That's what we're going to affect. But actually, it has limited effect. Can I just say to Ina Roos, and thank you, great to see you again. It's been a long time. It's been a long time since I've done some philosophy videos, so great to have you on board. Thank you so much for hanging out and for your really kind generosity. And good to have you back. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you. Now, I said I wouldn't mention God, and I keep forgetting that there are slides in here that have stuff on God. So this is an interesting idea. The God gene. So Dean Hamer got a bit is all a bit controversial, and it got a bit trashed in a lot of religious people didn't like it. But he brought a book out, or some research out, to talk about how there are gene variants that will predispose you to be more spiritual and therefore more likely to believe in God. And it got coined the God gene, and it wasn't quite, it was a bit of a misrepresentation of his work, but the work is pretty obvious, which is like, if we understand that genes are responsible for all your behaviors over here, like, oh, you get angry really quickly, or you're really good at converting oxygen into energy and running really quickly and stuff like that. Respiration, your body's really good at respiration, or you need to sleep more. Like, we go, oh, it's certain gene variables, or it's this or that, or he's eating too much, or there's some environmental variables, or there's some genetic variables, or both, right? But when it comes to believing in God, people are like, no, I can't be genetic. Oh no, spirituality, no, it can't be. It's got to be a choice. It's got to be a rational choice. Of course, they don't like that, because as soon as you start inviting in some kind of causal determination to the belief in God, suddenly it's like, well, if someone doesn't believe in God and that's what gets them sent to hell, that's a bit unfair if it's their genetic predisposition. But that's what the evidence suggests. So Dean Hamer found that the higher their spirituality score, the greater a person's ability to believe in a greater spiritual force, and more likely they were to have it share the gene VMA2. Studies on twins showed that those with this gene, a vesicular monoamine transporter that regulates the flow of mood-altering chemicals in the brain, were more likely to develop a spiritual belief. And the question is, if we're happy in accepting and predicting other behaviors on genetics, why not spirituality and belief? And in fact, we can do this with things like kindness. We used to think kindness, and this is often called pro-social behavior or pro-sociality. Pro-social behavior, we used to think, was the brain actively overcoming selfishness. In other words, if you were being kind, it's because you were putting effort into being kind, and actually that's kind of praiseworthy. Well done, you put effort into being kind. Turns out that now the research suggests that it's the amygdala that's doing the work to being kind, and that's an automatic functioning part of the brain. In other words, you're not suppressing selfishness, you're just being kind because that's what you do, and that's the kind of person you are, whether genetically or whether learned. It doesn't really matter actually what the causation definitely is. It just matters that there is causation there. That is not just you freely willing to be kind. People learn to be kind. It's kind of a learned behavior. And then when it's a learned behavior, then you don't think about it. It's just you're on autopilot, just being kind. But with that 58th time you're being kind, it's interesting to see that at that point, are you morally responsible for being kind? Or was it the fact that you learned to be kind previously and now you're just playing out that learnt behavior in the same way that you've kicked a football into the goal at that particular, you practiced that 1,000 times and now you're really good at that 1,000th time. Oh, well done. Actually, it's a responsibility of your life all up to that point. But then you see that it's also connected to a gene mutation, your kindness. So the mini mutation also affects behavior. So this was some work done by, is it Yao et al, I think, in sometime. Students with the Compatibilism gene donated twice as much money as on average as did fellow students with the Compatibilism variant, explains Reuter. This is the first time that researchers have been able to establish a connection between a particular gene and altruistic deeds. Sorry, that's a quote from one of my books. What happened here is they did an experiment, and it was like bogus experiment. They say, hey, come on, we want you to come in and see how many fingers you can stick in your ears or whatever. No, I'm obviously making that up. But they come in and get them to do an experiment, and they give them like 50 quid or 20 quid or whatever for that experiment. Thank you. Here's your money for doing the experiment. Oh, by the way, we've got a charity that we donate to at the lab here. So if you want to, you don't have to, but if you want to, you can put some of that money in the charity box. And it turns out that the people, so what the experiment was nothing to do with what they actually did there. They got their genetic blueprints, and they were testing to see how generous they were, on leaving with that money they'd just been given. And it turns out the people with a certain gene variant were twice as likely to be kind than people without that gene variant. And so then when we were talking about praiseworthiness and blameworthiness again, if you're saying well done for being so kind, I mean, it's good. It is nice to say well done. And there are reasons for saying that, you are affirming a positive behavior and they're more likely to do that again. So, there's lots of reasons to praise people and to set examples to other people, and they will want to be like that, and etc., etc., etc. But in and of itself, intrinsically, does that person deserve the praise of doing that if it's just their genes, if they're just acting out or largely acting out their genes? Now, I talk about John Rawls, the philosopher, talked about the natural lottery, not the national lottery, the natural lottery, which is, and I use the example of Ian Thorpe, who's a gold-winning um, Olympic swimmer, Australian Olympic swimmer, and you think, well done, and Australians will stand up and shout as any nation's supporters would, and congratulate him for getting that gold medal, for winning that race, and you're thinking, so what are we praising there? Because what happened is he won the natural lottery, so he was born with the kind of body that would grow. He would grow long limbs and big feet. He's got flipper-like feet. He's got parents that are really high aspiration and are going to take him to the swimming pool every day, early in the morning and late at night and whatever. They will support him in everything he does. He's got the aspirations himself. He's got the desire. He's a delayed gratification. So guaranteed he would have been a two-cookie boy that would have waited and then got the cookie, because that's the sort of person that can do delayed gratification, which is, I'm going to put in 10 years of hard graft in the swimming pool in the hope that at the end of the 10 years, I'm going to get a gold medal. So what you're doing then is you're understanding why this person's got a gold medal. Now, we all praise that person, say, well done, you deserve that. But actually, that person arguably was just acting out who they were with all the variables that the universe has doled out to that person, including their parents, including their experiences up to any given point in time. And those are what feed into getting that gold medal. And so it plays around with your idea of praiseworthiness and blameworthiness. I've talked about fear conditioning, Gao et al, and it was Adrian Rain as well involved in that. There you go. So I've talked about that already. Interesting. There's a great BBC Horizon documentary. You can find it online. Is Are We Good or Evil? And in that one, there's loads of great stuff in that BBC Horizon doc. But one of the ones was the guy that's done loads of, what's his name? Fallon. I think it's someone Fallon. He's done research into death row people, into psychopaths, basically, and into something called the warrior gene. Now, the warrior gene is a particular gene that is prevalent among people on death row, people, psychopaths, so on and so forth. And he's found that connection between antisocial behavior and having this warrior gene. But what was fascinating in his sort of life story is he'd done all this work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then he got his own genetic blueprint done. He's got his own genome mapped. And he found out that he had the warrior gene, right? He had this psychopathy gene. And he went back to his wife and his family and said, all this stuff on the warrior gene I've been doing for years, right? It turns out I've got the gene. And his wife apparently said, yeah, it doesn't surprise me at all. And the idea was that they understood that he was very much like that, but the fact that he had such a positive environment and upbringing, positive parenting and positive environment throughout his life and relationships meant that it's not just about having a gene. It's not like the gene, what did it, right? It's the fact that your genes are interacting with your environment, and sometimes your environment can be so positive that your negative genes, if you like, are mitigated. We are a maelstrom of biology, genetics, and environment. And all of that mixing together will affect how we end up doing things. There are things called mirror neurons. These are important in empathy. So empathy is a huge component of morality. If you can't empathize, I remember once I was teaching a kid and he threw a pencil in someone's eye. I sat down and said, look, mate, why did you throw that in his eye? I mean, surely you know what it feels like to have a pencil thrown in your eye. You can imagine what that feels like. And he's like, no. And it turns out he had Asperger's, actually. And it turns out he actually really couldn't put himself in the other person's shoes. And so therefore, he didn't really have a veto to stop him doing some things that you and I wouldn't do, or a neurotypical person wouldn't do. Because I think it's Asperger's. I don't want to sort of get that wrong. But it turns out that he certain people have to learn behaviors rather than intuitively, naturally having them. So it's like a cognitive learned behavior. So like, oh right, I have to learn that that's not a good thing to do because that would hurt him and blah blah blah. Okay, I've learned that now. I won't do that. Rather than going, well, I can imagine being that person if I had a pencil going in my eye. Ah, yeah, and that's called intersubjectivity. And the idea is that some people are less good at doing that. And one of the theories is that it could be there's a dysfunctional mirror neuron. Capacity. So your mirror neurons, they first discovered these, I think, Italian scientists working in a lab, actually on, I think, on a chimpanzee, probably doing some kind of vivisection. So it doesn't sound too nice. But they're looking at the brain electrodes or what. I know it probably wasn't vivisection, probably connected with like electrodes and whatnot. But what happened is an Italian scientist came into the lab and was eating an ice cream, and the chimpanzee's brain lit up, and it lit up in the exact way that the chimpanzee was eating an ice cream. In other words, empathy is us imagining we are that person. I mean, that's how we understand empathy, right? But actually, your mirror neurons fire because they mirror the activity that you're perceiving, and then in, cause that or a perception of that activity to be happening to yourself. In other words, when you see someone being punched, you feel sorry for them because you can imagine, like, if you had no empathy and you saw someone being punched, unless you learned that that's bad, like, it would just be neutral. It would be morally neutral. And so that's how important empathy is for morality. And yet, it's important to understand that some people, well, we have a spectrum of people who have, we have a spectrum of levels of empathy in humanity. So some people who naturally don't have as much empathy as others are probably going to be less able to, or less moral than others, to be simplistic about it. And it's absolutely vital to understand what is going on with people who are acting morally inappropriately. So, that's the only way to try and assure that kind of behavior doesn't happen going forward, both in that person and in other people. We understand, a greater understanding is the best weapon to making the world a better place. So yeah, there's just really interesting things that go on our brain, and I could talk about this forever and a day. Clarence Darrow, the very famous uh, lawyer, sorry, words, said, "What has this boy to do with it? He was not his own father. He was not his own mother. He was not his own grandparents. All of this was handed to him. He did not surround himself with governesses and wealth. He did not make himself, and yet he is to be compelled to pay." And that was a really fascinating kind of synopsis of the free will argument, which is to say that we're looking at this poor boy who's obviously done something wrong and we're making him pay for this. But do you know what? When you understand what his parents are like, what his grandparents are like, the fact that his entire environment was terrible on this and that, and he didn't make himself, he didn't design himself, it's just this thing taking in all these variables, and yet we're making him pay for that. That's just a fascinating little quote there. Now, here's an interesting bit of an anecdote. So, when I was writing my free will book, which is the first book I ever wrote, I wouldn't advise you buying this. I mean, it's obviously a great book, but actually, I would love to rewrite this. So, I've come a long way in writing in 12 years, and I could write like, the content's absolutely fine, but just I'd write it better. But anyway, in that book, I talked about Abdelmalek Bayut, who murdered in Italy, murdered a guy called Walter Perez, who had racially taunted him. So this guy taunted Bayut, and Bayut murdered him, and he was sentenced to 9 years and 2 months. But this, on appeal, he was given a shorter sentence. I think that might have been his shorter sentence. And he was given a shorter sentence. Oh, no, sorry. He was given a low sentence due to mitigating factors. For example, he was mentally imbalanced and had a history of psychiatric illness. So already the court is saying there are mitigating factors into your crime here. And this changes how we are going to sentence you. So we understand that you were unable to act in otherwise to some degree because you have psychiatric illnesses and you are mentally imbalanced. So that's a problem. Then in 2009, a couple of years later, an appeal court judge reduced his sentence by a year. And this is because the council maintained that he had 5 genes. So they did a genetic, map of him. And they showed that he had 5 genes that are linked to violent behavior. And they said he's more inclined to violent behavior. Therefore, it's unfair if you're going to give him, this long because he couldn't do anything about that. So I was talking to my partner about this story, and I said that's absolutely right because we don't have free will, we don't have libertarian free will, and this guy, it was his genes, and it was this situation, whatever. And my partner, who's not philosophical in the way I am, we were just there drinking a cup of tea and eating a cookie. I might have had 2 cookies because I'd waited that long. And she said, "Well, I wouldn't have cut his term; I would have extended it because if he's more likely to do it, then actually he's more likely to commit that crime again, and we need to keep him in prison longer." I was like, "Bang, you good?" I was like, "Yeah, that's really interesting." So actually, I'm arguing that he should have a shorter sentence because there are mitigating factors, and you're arguing he should have a longer sentence because of those same mitigating factors. So really interesting. In a 2002 report, the Nuffield Council on Bioethics concluded that the use of genetic information to help determine custodial sentences, along with other information such as previous convictions, should not be ruled out. And what we see is this is coming into the courts more and more and more. Just the understanding that there are so many variables at play. But at some point, do we have a court? I know. So I've got a friend, Greg Caruso, who's a philosopher and author. He's written a book with Daniel Dennett called Just Desserts. He's writing a lot of books at the moment to do with the crime and punishment, and he denies free will, libertarian free will, and he says, right, we need to completely overhaul the prison system. It needs to be rehabilitation and not retribution. There's no place to play for retribution if these people are doing what they're doing in the situation they're in, so on and so forth. And so his project is, okay, what do we do with this knowledge now? How do we enact the best policies that mean that we have the best society going forward? He advocates, him and another philosopher called Dirk Pereboom, and I agree with this, advocate the quarantine method for punishment. Is that there? No, it might come later. So the quarantine method for punishment is the fact that, okay, you're always going to do this. What would we do to someone who was really ill? Someone who's really ill and had a contagious disease that was going to infect someone else. So the parallel here is someone who's violent and is going to attack someone else. Okay, someone who has got an infectious disease is going to affect someone else. What we're going to do is we're going to take them, we're going to lock them away from society, but as humanely as possible, because what they've done is not, they haven't decided to do that. They're just, enacting their illness here. And we are going to do our very best to rehabilitate them and make them well. And we're going to keep them in quarantine until they're well. And if we can't get them well, we won't reintroduce them into society because that will be a danger to everyone else. But while they're locked away here, we are going to treat them as humanely as possible. So the quarantine approach to crime and punishment is to say that you've committed a crime, you're a harm to society, so we need to take you away from society. But we're going to try our damnedest to rehabilitate you. And when we are really confident, and this is the difficult part, is when do you know you're confident and how do you know, and yada yada yada. When we're really confident that we've rehabilitated you and you're not going to be a danger to society, we will reintegrate you into society. But while we're keeping you here in prison, we are going to treat you well. We're going to upskill you. This is what Norway do with their prison regime, which has only 30%, or in fact, it's in the 20s, I think, recidivism rates, which means that less than 30% of the people who go into prison will come back to prison having committed a crime again. In America, with certain, it depends what crime you're talking about, but the rates are like 86%. Like, it's just a revolving door because they don't worry about rehabilitation, especially if you privatize it and it's all about money. It's like, we want them to come back because that's our money. So actually, we're not that invested in making them better. But really, it should be about giving you the skills to go out and succeed in the world, not to punish you and go, you horrible criminal, I hate you, keep you in a horrible condition, Because then when you do eventually release them, if you do release them, they're going to be really resentful of everything, and they'll have no skills, and they're just going to go out and commit the crime again. So what you should do is take them in and go, right, you've got some problems, let's solve those problems, and let's give you the skills to succeed in society. And then once you've done your time in here, and once we've upskilled you, and once you are no longer a threat to society, we'll let you back out, job done. You won't commit another crime, and you'll be a valued member of society. So there you go. That's a quarantine method. So crime and responsibility, I turned out okay because of the way I was raised, because of the love my parents had for me as I was growing up, and the skill with which they nurtured me. Yeah, of course. So I turned out okay because of, the way that you were brought up. I've talked about the natural lottery, praise and blame being useful for influencing future behavior. I'm going to talk, and I've talked to you about tumors, but I'm going to mention someone else with a tumor. Sorry, I've got this in the wrong order because I just get ahead of myself and I haven't looked at this PowerPoint for about 5 years. There's a guy called Charles Whitman who was an absolutely normal guy, married, whatever. He ended up killing his wife, I think. Did he kill anyone else? There, and then went up to the top of a tower at the university in Texas. It was in Austin. Sorry, and shot people from that tower. It was terrible. Anyway, he wrote a suicide letter. I think he killed himself. He wrote a letter saying that, please, can you check my body out afterwards, because I think I've gone a bit weird. I'm paraphrasing, obviously. I'm not my usual self. So then they did an autopsy on him. It turns out he had a tumor, and the tumor is what was making him do these things. Now the idea is that if we let someone off because their brain states were being impinged upon by some kind of natural physical entity, right? And we say, okay, we understand you did that because you had a brain tumor. We've taken the brain tumor out. You're okay now. We're okay to mitigate your responsibility in that situation. What's the difference between that kind of natural scenario and just your normal brain doing its things? And I think there's no category difference there, because I think we just got natural stuff going on. And in one case, you've got a tumor that's kind of doing an extra bunch of natural stuff, or you've just got your brain doing natural stuff. So if you just got your brain doing natural stuff, then that's your brain causing your behavior. And this plays around with your praiseworthiness and blameworthiness. So I think, I haven't explained that particularly well, but I've written an article on Charles Whitman and how that if we use theories of mitigation for his responsibility in that scenario, then actually that same kind of logic can be applied to every human being acting all the time. There's no difference between our neural states of a neurotypical person just doing their stuff. Why should I get praised or blamed intrinsically for doing that? Yet in this situation, just with a tumor, we treat them very differently. So there you go. Anyway, we're sort of coming towards the end here. So I've talked about the quarantine approach to punishment, and the fact that retribution is kind of pointless. There's no point having retribution, because it's like, I can't believe you did that. Oh, I'm so angry with you. No, I understand why you did that. You did that because you're the person you are, in the situation you are in, and I understand all the causal variables, and I understand why you did that. I don't like it. It's not good. But in my matrix of punishment, in why I'm punishing you, retribution plays no part. And it is all about rehabilitation and arguably deterrence. It's interesting, deterrence, like the research that's been done on deterrence and punishment. It turns out that the harsher the punishment you give a criminal, it doesn't have a great effect on deterring either them or other people not to do that. There's a very minimal effect on deterrence. So harsh punishments actually don't deter people. What deters people more is the chance of getting caught. So it turns out that if, and it's kind of like a bit of a truism, if you're going to go into a shop and you think, oh, I could do a bit of shoplifting now and nick this loaf of bread, right? If you think, right, there's actually a 99.9% chance of me being caught if I do this, you ain't going to do it. So the chance of you getting caught is a much better deterrence, than the idea that you're going to get harsh punishment. I mean, everyone thinks they're never going to get caught anyway, type thing. You've got this kind of invincibility. So yeah. Anyway, so really, for me, punishment should be about rehabilitation. So it's better to ask why people do stuff and try and change their causal circumstance and change a causal circumstance for other people in similar situations. Now, the question is, and I'm not going to answer it now because we come to the end, but moral value versus moral responsibility. The idea is that if we can understand why people do particular things, and if they were always going to do what they were going to do in the situation they're in, because they are who they are in that environmental scenario, what does this say about moral responsibility? Do we have moral responsibility? Is there such a thing as moral responsibility? I would argue, as with people like Dirk Pereboom and Greg Caruso, that we don't have moral responsibility. But we still have morality. Morality is still a good thing, but it's a bit like aesthetics. It's a bit like beauty. I can look at a painting and say that's beautiful. I can look at a moral action, and say that's a good moral action because I want that. I want all people to do that. But do you have moral responsibility in doing that? Moral responsibility is a different idea than just morality, and when we understand causality and the fact that it's a matrix of the universe that's causally influencing your behavior and all of our behavior, then I think moral responsibility disappears. Dirk Pereboom wrote about what do we lose by that, and actually the reality is not a lot. So just to come to the end, I talked about Strawson and reactive attitudes, that he says that we might as well believe we got it because, it's hard to get away from that. Saul Smolanski wrote a whole book. He's an Israeli philosopher, wrote a whole book saying we don't have free will. We don't have free will. Here's why we don't have free will. But then he said, but I think it's really, so some people like Greg Caruso and Dirk Pereboom think it's really beneficial to embrace the fact that we don't have free will. And they say, it's great. We don't have free will, and actually, it'll make a world a better place if we embrace that and we understand that, and we can make the crime and punishment better. We can just improve the world. Saul Smolanski took the other route, and he said, actually, I think it's a real problem. If we all believe we didn't have free will, then the world would go nuts and it will all go wrong. So he wrote books saying, on the one hand, we don't have free will, and then he kind of said, but don't tell anyone. Like, it's bad. It's bad news. We don't have free will, but shh. I'm obviously being facetious, but that's a general idea. One of the biggest challenge is fatalism, which is the idea like, well, what's the point if there's nothing we can do about it? But the idea is, well, you can have free will illusionism, which is you can imagine you can just live your life as if you have it. But maybe think about it in a bigger context, like crime and punishment. Think about it when you're evaluating other human beings in a major way. But the kind of like some people do get stuck in this fatalism as there's nothing we can do. We're just dominoes. But that doesn't say anything about the truth or falsity of libertarian free will or causal determinism. It's just a psychological disposition, I would argue. And finally, the very last slide here is this doctrine contributes to the welfare of our social existence, says Spinoza, Baruch Spinoza from the 17th century, I think, since it teaches us to hate no one. This is where Greg Caruso and Dirk Pereboom, people I keep mentioning, go. So they say that you should put away your anger. If you recognize that free will doesn't exist, put away that anger, understand people for who they are. This doctrine contributes to the welfare of our social existence since it teaches us to hate no one, to despise no one, to mock no one, to be angry with no one, and to envy no one. There you go. There's a great Chinese proverb. I don't know if it's connected to this. Might be connected to this. I keep saying this because I love this proverb, but I have a problem with getting angry in certain situations, and I know I shouldn't. And I was saying to my son the other day, who's getting really angry. He's obviously a bit like me, getting really angry at something. And I said, mate, it's an old Chinese proverb. If there's nothing you can do about it, there's no point getting angry because you can't do anything about it. If there's something you can do about it, there's no point getting angry. You should go and do that thing about it. And I love that. There's nothing you can do about it, don't get angry. If there's something you can do about it, don't get angry. Do that thing. Anyway, there you go. I hope that was of use to you guys. Let me know if you have any questions, and whether I'm just having a quick look through. Well, so there is a question from JD Curse, who says, have you ever been to a prison in the US? There's some really interesting documentaries. In fact, they've just done this with Anne Widdecombe, who's a real conservative wingnut politician from the UK. But she went out to some Norwegian prisons to see how they did it. There's a really good Norwegian documentary about an American superintendent from a prison who had run prisons before, and he was obviously the old school type of, like, treat them harsh and blah blah blah. Went over to Norway and saw these really liberal prisons and how they did things and skilling them up. And these guys were learning guitar and they were giving them skills to this and all skills to get them jobs or what, so on and so forth. And he's like, wow, this is totally different. And it's just um, really interesting look at the two different prison systems, but also how someone who's entrenched in one worldview, if you like, reacts to a worldview that's entirely different. And there's obviously cognitive dissonance going on, and there's kind of like rejection, yet also understanding that these are the most successful prisons in the world for recidivism rates. Anyway, you can find that on YouTube. I think it's called the Norden documentary, or Nord something. There you go. What do we have to say? That was great. I got a huge comment to drop on our other thing. Thank you. I look forward to that, JD. Lee says, thanks, Jonathan. I really enjoyed tonight. Can't wait for next time. I need my mind opening. You're the man. You're the man. Night, mate. Thanks, Lee. Really appreciate that. Thank you. So that is where I'm at with free will. Libertarian free will doesn't exist. So the question is, what next? What do we do with that? How do we live our lives if it doesn't exist? Is it better to live under the illusion that it does exist? Is it better to accept that it is an illusion and it was a useful illusion, maybe an evolved trait? There's some interesting theories about how libertarian free will is something that's evolved because it's been useful for us heretofore. But going forward, do we still need it? This useful illusion? Can we improve the world with a rejection of libertarian free will? All of these questions are for another time. But in the meantime, that gives you hopefully a good basis for understanding this topic. Thank you so much for being there on the live chat, for watching. Thank you for all of your support. You're all wonderful people. I'm sorry that I haven't got through to all your live comments, but the idea is that talking to each other is obviously super cool as well. And thank you so much to the people who were super generous. Ina Roos, Lee Dixon, and me good old Cobber and mate Chindi Chimbaloo. Gonna have to get him back on the show at some point. He's probably gone to bed now or something. No, it's in America. He won't be going to bed. Anyway, Toodle Pips, thanks for everything. All the best. And have a think about this tomorrow in your daily life. Think about free will. Think about why you do things that you do, why other people do things that you do. And just start questioning stuff and seeing whether your perspective changes on how the universe works and how your interactions with people might be affected. Anyway, just a little bit of homework. Thanks. Take care. Big love.